I spent 7 years becoming the perfect wife. The kind of woman people admire from a distance but never truly understand. The kind who wakes before sunrise to prepare breakfast that will grow cold on a table set for two. Who memorizes her husband's schedule better than her own heartbeat. Who smiles through silence, through absence, through the slow, invisible erosion of love. And if you had asked anyone about my life, they would have said I was lucky, that I had everything: a powerful husband, a beautiful home, a future secured by wealth and status. But what they never saw was how empty it all felt when the doors closed at night. How the man I married always seemed just out of reach, like a stranger wearing the face of someone I once loved. And yet I stayed, because I believed love was something you protected, something you endured for, something that would eventually come back if you just held on long enough. And so I did. For 7 years I held on, until the night everything finally broke. It was our anniversary, a date I had remembered when he had clearly forgot. And I spent the entire day preparing, cooking his favorite dishes, setting the table with quiet care, choosing a dress he once said he liked, convincing myself that maybe tonight would be different, that maybe this would be the night he looked at me the way he used to, the way I had spent years trying to earn back. But as the hours passed and the food turned cold and the candles burned low, I began to feel that familiar ache settle in my chest, the quiet realization that hope, no matter how stubborn, cannot survive forever in the absence of love. When the door finally opened, it was already too late for anything to be saved, though I didn't know that yet, not until I heard his voice, softer than I had heard it in years, not directed at me, but at someone else, and something inside me tightened as I stepped toward the sound, each movement heavier than the last, as if part of me already understood what I was about to see, but refused to accept it. And then I turned the corner and everything I had spent 7 years believing in collapsed in a single moment. He was standing there with another woman, his hand resting on her waist with an ease that felt practiced familiar, as if it belonged there, and she was smiling up at him in a way I had not seen directed at me in years. Her presence soft and delicate, her expression innocent in a way that felt almost mocking. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even, because my mind rejected what my eyes were showing me. Rejected the reality that the man I had loved so completely had already given himself to someone else without hesitation. The plate slipped from my hands before I realized I was holding it, shattering against the floor with a sharp, unforgiving sound that forced the moment into reality. And they both turned toward me, his expression shifting not to guilt, not to panic, but to something far worse, something indifferent, like I was the interruption, like I was the one who didn't belong in that space anymore. And in that instant, something inside me broke in a way that could never be repaired. Because betrayal isn't just about what someone does, it's about what it reveals. And what I saw in his eyes that night was the truth I had been avoiding for years. He didn't love me. Maybe he never did. "You're home early," he said, as if this were normal, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience in my own life. And I wanted to ask how long, wanted to demand answers, wanted to scream until the pain in my chest made sense. But all that came out was a quiet, trembling question. "Who is she?" And the woman beside him tightened her hold on his arm, her confidence subtle but undeniable, as if she already knew the answer didn't matter, as if she knew she had already won. And he didn't hesitate when he responded, didn't try to soften the blow or hide behind excuses. He simply said, "Someone important." And those two words cut deeper than anything else could have, because they confirmed what I had refused to see, that everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had believed in, had meant nothing to him in the end. I don't remember leaving the house, only the feeling of the cold night air against my skin, the way my chest felt too tight, like I was suffocating under the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I had ignored, everything I had endured for the sake of a love that never truly existed. And I walked without direction, without purpose, because there was nowhere left to go, no version of my life that still made sense after what I had just seen. And as the rain began to fall, soaking through my clothes, blurring my vision, I realized something too late to change anything, that all the signs had always been there. In the late nights, the distant replies, the way he stopped looking at me like I mattered, and I had chosen not to see them, because seeing them would have meant accepting a truth I wasn't ready to face. The sound of tires against wet pavement came too suddenly, too sharply, and by the time I turned, it was already too late. The world tilting, the ground rushing up to meet me, and in that final moment, as everything faded into darkness, there was only one thought left in my mind, one bitter, fragile realization that echoed louder than anything else. I had given him everything. And in the end, I died with nothing. I died loving him while he was loving someone else. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I felt wasn't pain, but confusion, thick and suffocating, like waking from a dream that refused to fully release me. And for a moment I couldn't couldn't even breathe properly, because the last thing I remembered was the impact. The cold rain, the overwhelming weight of betrayal crushing down on me as the world went dark, and yet now. There was no rain, no broken street, no blood, only the faint scent of fresh flowers and the soft rustle of fabric somewhere nearby. And as my vision slowly cleared, the world around me came into focus in a way that made my heart stop all over again. Because I knew this place. I knew it far too well. I was sitting in front of a mirror, my reflection staring back at me with eyes that looked the same, but felt entirely different, younger, untouched. Unaware of everything that had already happened, and yet carrying all of it beneath the surface. And behind me, hanging carefully like a silent declaration of fate, was the wedding dress I had chosen with trembling hands in another lifetime. The same dress I believed marked the beginning of my happiness. The same dress that now felt like a warning I had been too blind to understand. My fingers trembled as I lifted my hand, touching my face as if to confirm that I was real, that this wasn't some cruel illusion my mind had created in its final moments. And the warmth of my skin, the steady rhythm of my pulse, the quiet sound of my own breathing grounded me in a truth that felt impossible and undeniable all at once. I was alive. And more than that, I had returned to the day everything began. A sharp knock on the door pulled me from the spiral of realization, followed by a familiar voice calling my name, gentle, concerned. The same voice that had once comforted me, that I had trusted without question. And for a split second, my chest tightened as memory collided with reality, because I knew that voice now in a way I hadn't before. Knew the smile that came with it, the warmth that hid something far colder beneath the surface. "Are you ready?" she asked from the other side. Her tone soft, affectionate, perfectly timed, and I felt something inside me go still. Something that had once reacted with instinctive trust now held back by knowledge I could never unlearn. Because I had seen her before. Not like this, not in this moment, but standing beside him, close enough to touch, close enough to replace me without hesitation. I didn't answer right away, not because I couldn't, but because I was thinking, calculating, trying to piece together what this second chance meant, what I was supposed to do with it. Because if I had truly returned to this moment, if I had truly been given the opportunity to rewrite everything, then I couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again, couldn't afford to let emotion guide me the way it once had. "I'm coming," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. And as I stood, my gaze fell once more on the dress waiting for me, the symbol of everything I had once believed in, everything I had lost. And for a brief moment I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of understanding, because wearing that dress again meant stepping back into the same life, the same role, the same carefully constructed illusion that had led to my destruction. But it also meant something else, something far more important. It meant access. It meant proximity. It meant the chance to change things from within rather than running away from them. When I opened the door, she was standing there exactly as I remembered, her expression warm, her eyes bright with what appeared to be genuine concern. And if I hadn't lived through it already, I might have believed her again, might have trusted that smile, might have let her stand beside me as I walked toward the same fate. But this time, I saw through it, saw the subtle flicker in her gaze as she looked at me, as if measuring something, as if assessing whether I was still the same person she could so easily outmaneuver. And for the first time, I realized that she had always been watching, always been waiting for the right moment to step into a space I didn't even know I was losing. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice soft, sincere, and I held her gaze just a second longer than necessary, long enough to make her wonder, long enough to create a crack in the perfect image she had built, before I allowed a small, polite smile to form. "Thank you," I replied, my tone calm, controlled, so different from the nervous excitement I had once felt that even she seemed to notice, her brows drawing together ever so slightly as if trying to understand what had changed. The ceremony passed in a blur after that, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I had already seen it, already lived it, already watched it lead to an ending I refused to repeat. And when he stood in front of me, when our eyes met in that carefully orchestrated moment that was supposed to mean everything, I felt nothing, no warmth, no anticipation, no lingering hope, only a quiet, steady clarity that settled deep within me like something unshakable. He spoke his vows exactly as he had before, the same promises, the same carefully chosen words that would later prove meaningless. And I repeated mine in return, not because I believed in them, but because I understood what they gave me, the position, the access, the power to remain close enough to change the outcome of everything that followed. And as the ring slid onto my finger, I made a silent vow of my own, one that carried far more weight than anything spoken aloud. I would never love him again. The reception was filled with laughter and celebration, with people congratulating us on a union they believed was perfect. And I played my part flawlessly, smiling when expected, responding when spoken to, maintaining the image that had once defined me. Because this time, I wasn't just living this life, I was navigating it, shaping it, controlling it in ways I had never understood before. And throughout it all, I could feel his gaze on me, lingering just a little longer than it used to, as if something about me felt unfamiliar, as if he was trying to understand why the woman standing beside him no longer fit the version he thought he knew. That night, when the doors finally closed and the noise faded away, when the world outside our room ceased to exist, he reached for me out of habit, out of routine, out of something that had nothing to do with love. And I stepped back, just slightly, just enough to break the pattern, just enough to create a distance that had never existed before. And for the first time I saw it, clear and undeniable, the flicker of confusion in his eyes, brief but real, and it was in that moment that everything truly began. Because this time, I wasn't the woman who would wait for him to change this time. I was the one who had already decided to walk away, even if I hadn't taken the final step yet. The first morning after the wedding began in a silence that felt completely different from the one I remembered. Not heavy with disappointment, not filled with quiet longing, but sharp, clear, almost unfamiliar in its stillness. And as I opened my eyes, I didn't reach for him, didn't instinctively turn to check if he was there, because I already knew what I would find. The empty space beside me, cool and undisturbed, just as it had been in the life I had already lived. And for a moment I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting that realization settle fully. Because this was the point where everything used to begin. The cycle of giving, of adjusting, of shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never truly mine. But this time, I didn't move this time. I let the silence remain exactly as it was, because I was no longer interested in filling it. When I finally got out of bed, it wasn't out of habit. It was a choice, a small but deliberate shift that carried more weight than it should have. And instead of heading straight to the kitchen the way I once did, instead of preparing breakfast that would go untouched, I walked to the window, pulling the curtains open to let the morning light flood the room. The city stretching out before me in a way that felt almost new, as if I were seeing it for the first time without the filter of expectation, without the constant awareness of someone else's needs overshadowing my own. The sound of the door opening behind me broke the quiet, and I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The steady rhythm of his footsteps, something I had memorized long ago. But when he spoke, there was something different in his tone, subtle but unmistakable, a slight hesitation that hadn't been there before. "You're awake," he said, and I could hear the question beneath the statement, the unspoken confusion about why I wasn't already in the kitchen, why the routine had shifted without warning. And I almost smiled at how quickly something so small could disrupt the balance he had always taken for granted. "I am," I replied calmly, turning to face him without the softness I once carried, without the quiet anticipation that he might look at me with warmth, because I already knew he wouldn't. And more importantly, I no longer cared if he did. For a brief moment, he studied me, his gaze lingering just a second longer than usual, as if trying to place something that felt slightly off, something he couldn't quite identify. And I could almost see the thought forming behind his eyes, the subtle awareness that the woman standing in front of him was not entirely the same as the one he had married just hours ago. "You didn't make breakfast," he said after a moment, not accusing, not even particularly concerned, just stating an observation as if it were a fact of the world that had somehow shifted out of alignment. And I tilted my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting the expectation behind it. "I wasn't hungry," I replied simply, and the ease of the answer seemed to catch him off guard more than any argument would have. Because there was nothing to challenge, nothing to correct, just a quiet refusal to follow a pattern he had never questioned before. He didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, I could feel the tension begin to build, subtle but present, like something just beneath the surface waiting to be acknowledged. And I realized then that this was how it would start, not with dramatic confrontations or explosive arguments, but with small, deliberate choices that slowly unraveled everything he thought he understood about me. The rest of the morning passed in a similar rhythm, each moment a quiet deviation from the past, each action a step further away from the person I used to be. And by the time afternoon came, I could already see the effect it was having on him, not in anything he said, but in the way he watched me, the way his attention lingered just a little longer, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together the way it once had. That evening, when we were in the same room again, the silence between us felt different, not distant, not empty, but charged, as if something unspoken was waiting to surface. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more measured, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "You've been acting strange," he said, and I turned to look at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without the instinct to soften the moment. Because this time, I wasn't afraid of what he might think. "Have I asked lightly, not denying it, not confirming it, just allowing the question to hang in the air between us. And I watched as his expression shifted, just slightly, the faintest crease forming between his brows as if he were trying to understand something that no longer followed the rules he was used to. "You're different," he added after a moment. And this time, there was less certainty in his voice, less control, and more something else, something closer to curiosity than judgment. And I let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch my lips, not out of amusement, but out of acknowledgement. "Maybe," I replied. And that single word seemed to unsettle him more than anything else I could have said, because it offered no explanation, no reassurance, no return to familiarity, only the quiet confirmation that whatever had changed was real, and it wasn't going away. For a few seconds, we just stood there, the distance between us no longer defined by absence, but by something far more deliberate, something I had chosen rather than something I was forced to endure. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, the first real crack in the world he had always taken for granted. Because for the first time, he wasn't certain of me, and that uncertainty, however small, was enough to begin unraveling everything. By the time the first company event arrived after our wedding, I was ready. Not because I had prepared anything elaborate, but because I already knew how the night would unfold if I did nothing. And this time, doing nothing was no longer an option, because I had lived through the consequences of silence, and I refused to repeat them again. In my past life, I had attended these gatherings like a shadow at his side, elegant, quiet, present but never truly seen, smiling politely while conversations flowed around me without ever touching me. But tonight felt different from the moment I stepped into the room, not because anyone else noticed, but because I did, because I carried myself differently, because I no longer saw this place as his world that I had been allowed to enter, but as a stage where I could choose how I appeared, how I moved, how I played my roles. The lights were soft, the atmosphere polished and controlled, filled with the low hum of conversations and the quiet clinking of glasses. And for a while, I simply observed, letting the rhythm of the room settle into place, because I knew what I was waiting for, knew exactly who would walk through that door and when. And sure enough, just as the evening reached its peak, she appeared, exactly as I remembered, graceful, composed, her presence drawing subtle attention without demanding it, her smile warm in a way that made people lower their guard without realizing it. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room, and I saw it, that flicker of recognition, not of memory, but of instinct, as if something about me felt unfamiliar to her, as if she could sense the difference without understanding it. And instead of looking away the way I once would have, I held her gaze, steady and unflinching, letting that moment stretch just long enough to make her wonder. He noticed her soon after. Of course he did, his attention shifting almost unconsciously in her direction, and I recognized that movement instantly, the beginning of a pattern I had once ignored. And for a moment, I let it happen, let the familiar script begin to play out, not because I couldn't stop it, but because I wanted to see how much of it would remain the same, how much would change simply because I had. She approached us with perfect timing, her expression soft, her tone light as she greeted him first, then turned to me with that same carefully crafted warmth that once felt genuine and now felt almost rehearsed. And I responded with equal calm, matching her composure without revealing anything beneath the surface. Because this time, I wasn't reacting, I was observing, measuring, choosing my moment. But instead of waiting for her to guide the conversation, instead of letting her control the pace the way she had before, I stepped forward first, closing the distance between us in a way that was subtle but deliberate, shifting the balance without drawing attention to it. "It's nice to finally meet you," I said, my voice calm, polite, carrying just enough meaning beneath it to make her pause, just enough to disrupt the expectation she had built. And for a fraction of a second, her smile faltered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see the crack forming beneath the surface. "We've met before," she replied smoothly, recovering almost instantly, her tone unchanged, but I could see the adjustment happening behind her eyes, the quiet recalculation as she tried to understand what had shifted. And I tilted my head slightly, allowing a faint smile to form. "Have we?" I said softly, and the question hung between us, light on the surface but heavier underneath, because it wasn't about memory, it was about awareness, about the fact that I was no longer playing the role she expected me to play. For a moment, the air between us tightened, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough for all three of us to feel it. And I saw it then clearly, the first real sign that something had changed, because instead of responding to her the way he once would have, instead of naturally aligning himself with her presence, his gaze shifted, just briefly toward me, as if checking something, as if measuring my reaction. And that single moment, that tiny hesitation, told me everything I needed to know. My actions were already changing the course of events. I didn't react, didn't acknowledge it outwardly, but inside, something sharpened, something settled into place, Because this was the opening I had been waiting for, the proof that the future was no longer fixed, that every small choice I made could ripple outward in ways that would eventually reshape everything. The rest of the evening unfolded with a quiet tension that lingered just beneath the surface, invisible to everyone else but impossible for me to ignore, because I could see it in the way she adjusted her approach. The way her smile lingered a little longer, her tone softened just slightly more, as if she were trying to regain control of something slipping just beyond her reach. And I could see it in him as well, in the way his attention moved between us, less certain than before, less predictable, as if he were caught between something familiar and something new, something he didn't yet understand. And for the first time since my return, I allowed myself the smallest hint of satisfaction, not because I had won anything yet, but because I finally understood the game I was playing, finally saw the path unfolding in front of me with a clarity I had never possessed before. And as I stood there, surrounded by the same people, the same setting, the same carefully constructed world that had once trapped me, I realized something that changed everything this time. I wasn't the one being moved this time. I was the one making the moves. The shift became undeniable the moment I stopped asking for permission to exist outside of him, and by the next morning, I made a decision that my past self would have never even considered. I left the house without telling him where I was going, without leaving a message, without waiting for him to notice, because for the first time, I understood that my life did not need to be accounted for in order to have value. And as I stepped out into the city, the air felt different, lighter, as if the world had expanded in ways I had never allowed myself to see before. I didn't go anywhere extraordinary. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about the destination. It was about the act itself, about reclaiming something I had given away without realizing it. And as I walked through familiar streets that now felt strangely new, I let myself exist without expectation, without obligation, without the constant awareness of someone else's needs shaping my every movement. When I returned home hours later, the atmosphere had already changed, subtle but unmistakable, like something had been disturbed in my absence, and I saw it immediately in the way he was standing in the living room, still in his work clothes, his posture slightly more rigid than usual, his gaze fixed on the door as if he had been waiting, not patiently, but deliberately. "Where were you?" he asked the moment I stepped inside, his voice controlled but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. And I paused just long enough to take in the moment, to recognize what it meant, because this wasn't indifference, this wasn't distance, this was attention, and even if it came wrapped in tension, it was still something new, out. I replied simply, setting my bag down without offering anything. And the word hung between us, brief and complete, intentionally so, because I was no longer filling in the blanks for him, no longer making things easier to understand. His expression tightened slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice the shift, the subtle loss of control, as he processed the absence of information he was used to receiving without question. "You didn't say anything," he continued, taking a step closer, his tone still measured but edged with something sharper now, something closer to frustration. And I met his gaze without hesitation, without the instinct to soften or explain. "I didn't think I needed to," I said calmly, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have, because it wasn't just about where I had been, it was about what my answer represented, a boundary that had never existed before, a shift in the dynamic that he could feel but didn't yet understand. He stepped closer again, the space between us narrowing, not aggressively, but with intent, as if trying to reestablish something that had slipped just out of his grasp. And I didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't adjust to accommodate him the way I once would have. And in that moment, something changed, something subtle but irreversible, because for the first time, we weren't standing in the roles we had always occupied. We were standing as equals in a space that neither of us fully controlled. "You've been acting strange," he said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and I tilted my head slightly, studying him with a quiet curiosity that felt entirely new. "Have I replied, not denying it, not confirming it, just allowing the question to linger, and I watched as his gaze sharpened, as if trying to read something beneath the surface that I was no longer willing to reveal. "You're different," he added, and this time, there was less certainty in his tone, less control, and more something else, something closer to unease, and I let a faint smile touch my lips, not out of amusement, but out of acknowledgement. "Maybe I am," I said softly, and that simple admission seemed to unsettle him more than anything else I could have said, because it offered no explanation, no reassurance, no return to the familiarity he had relied on for so long. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, the air between us thick with something unspoken, something shifting in ways neither of us could fully define, and then, unexpectedly, He asked the question that marked the true beginning of everything. "Who was that woman this morning?" he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper, something closer to suspicion than curiosity. And for a brief moment, I considered how I might have answered before, how I would have immediately explained, reassured, clarified, but now I simply met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Does it matter?" I asked, turning the question back on him, and I saw it then clearly. The moment something inside him shifted, the moment he realized that this conversation was no longer following the rules he understood, that I was no longer responding in ways he could predict. "Of course it matters," he said, the certainty in his voice returning, but thinner now, less solid than before, and I took a small step back, not to create distance, but to redefine it, to make it clear that I was choosing the space between us rather than being shaped by it. "You never asked before," I said quietly, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, and the words seemed to land harder than anything else, because they couldn't be denied, couldn't be dismissed, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. He didn't respond immediately, and in that pause, I could see it, the realization beginning to form, the awareness that something fundamental had changed, not just in me, but in the way we existed together. And as I turned away, leaving him standing there with questions he couldn't answer, I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't just about pulling away anymore. This was about taking control. And for the first time in my life, I finally had it. The change in him didn't happen all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, woven into small moments that would have meant nothing before, but now carried a weight neither of us could ignore. And I noticed it first in the way he started paying attention to things he had never cared about. The way his gaze lingered just a second longer when I entered a room. The way his questions, though still rare, began to carry something beneath them, something sharper, something closer to interest than obligation. And I understood immediately what it was: not love, not yet, but the beginning of awareness, the realization that something he had always taken for granted was no longer within his control. It was during another company gathering that the shift became undeniable, not because of anything dramatic, but because of something far more subtle, far more revealing: the introduction of someone new, someone who had not played a significant role in my past life, but now stood at the edge of this one like an unexpected variable, a business partner of his, confident, composed, the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. And when we were introduced, I didn't shrink back the way I once would have, didn't defer to my husband's presence. I met his gaze directly, spoke with calm assurance, allowed the conversation to flow naturally, instead of carefully measuring every word. And I could feel it immediately. The shift in energy, the way attention settled differently, the way I was no longer just an extension of someone else, but a presence in my own right. He noticed it too. Of course he did. I could see it in the way his expression changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to question, but enough for me to recognize the tension forming beneath the surface. The way his gaze moved between us, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary, as if trying to understand something he couldn't quite define. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, something I had never seen in him before. Not indifference, not control, but something far more unstable, something unfamiliar: jealousy. It was subtle, almost hidden, but it was there, in the way he interrupted the conversation slightly sooner than expected, in the way his tone shifted just enough to reassert his presence, in the way his hand rested briefly at my waist, not with affection, not with warmth, but with something closer to possession, as if reminding both me and himself of the role I was supposed to play. And if this had been my past life, I might have felt comfort in that gesture, might have mistaken it for care, but now, all I saw was the underlying insecurity, the quiet fear that something was slipping beyond his reach. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean into it either. I simply allowed the moment to exist without reinforcing it, without giving it the meaning he might have expected, and that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him, because he was used to reactions, used to responses that confirmed his place. And now, I was giving him nothing, no reassurance, no resistance, just a quiet, steady presence that refused to be defined by him. The rest of the evening unfolded with that same underlying tension, each interaction carrying a subtle edge, each glance holding a question that remained unanswered. And I could see it not only in him, but in her as well, the way her attention sharpened, the way her movements became more deliberate, as if she had begun to sense the shift, as if she realized that whatever path she had planned was no longer as certain as it once seemed. When we finally left, when the noise of the event faded behind us and the quiet of the car settled in, the space between us felt different again, not distant, not cold, but charged with something unspoken, something waiting to surface. And I didn't speak, didn't fill the silence the way I once would have, because I knew he would, because I could feel it building in him, the need to understand, the need to regain control of something he no longer fully grasped. "You seemed comfortable tonight," he said after a while, his voice neutral but carrying an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. And I turned to look at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Was I not supposed to be?" I asked calmly. And for a moment, he didn't answer, his expression tightening slightly as if weighing his words, as if trying to phrase something he wasn't used to feeling. "That's not what I meant," he said finally, but there was less certainty in his tone now, less control, and more something else, something closer to unease. "Then what did you mean?" I pressed gently, not aggressively, but enough to keep the conversation moving, enough to make him confront what he was trying to avoid. And for a brief second I saw it, clear and undeniable, the hesitation, the flicker of something he couldn't quite hide, because he didn't have an answer that fit the version of himself he had always maintained. "You were different," he said instead, falling back on the same observation he had made before. But this time, it carried more weight, more awareness, and I let a faint smile touch my lips. "I told you that already," I replied softly, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to frustrate him more than anything else, because it offered no resolution, no clarity, just the quiet confirmation that whatever had changed was real, and it wasn't going away. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't empty, it wasn't comfortable, it was filled with something new, something fragile, something on the verge of breaking. And as I looked out at the city lights passing by, I realized something with absolute certainty, something that would shape everything that followed. This was the moment he began to feel it. Not the loss itself, not yet, but the fear of it, the quiet, unsettling realization that I was no longer someone he could take for granted. And once that fear takes root, it doesn't fade, it grows slowly, steadily, until it consumes everything. And this time, I intended to let it. The truth never reveals itself all at once. It doesn't arrive with clarity or certainty. It unfolds slowly, piece by piece, in moments that seem insignificant until they begin to connect, until they form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. And by the time I reached that point, I already knew something was wrong, not just with him, not just with her, but with everything I thought I understood about the life I had lived before. It started with something small, something I almost overlooked, a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, voices low behind a half-closed door at one of his offices, familiar enough to make me pause, unfamiliar enough to make me listen. And I recognized her immediately, that soft, careful tone, the way she spoke as if every word had been measured in advance. But what caught my attention wasn't her voice, it was what she was saying, the fragments that slipped through the silence, just enough to make my chest tighten with something sharper than anger, something closer to realization. "He's starting to notice," she said quietly, and there was no warmth in her voice this time, no softness, only calculation. And I felt something inside me go still, because that wasn't the voice of someone in love. It was the voice of someone executing a plan. "Then adjust," another voice replied, calm, unfamiliar male. And I frowned slightly, because this wasn't part of the story I remembered. This wasn't something I had seen before, and for the first time since my return, uncertainty crept in, subtle but undeniable, because if there were pieces I hadn't known about, then there were variables I couldn't fully control. I didn't stay long enough to hear more, didn't need to, because what I had already heard was enough to shift everything, enough to force me to reconsider the past I thought I understood. Because if she had been planning something, if her presence in our lives had been more than just opportunistic, then it meant that what happened before wasn't as simple as betrayal. It was something deeper, something more deliberate. That realization followed me long after I left, threading through my thoughts as I replayed every memory, every moment I had dismissed, every detail I had overlooked. And for the first time, I began to question not just her actions but his. Because if there had been manipulation, if there had been something hidden beneath the surface, then what had he truly known? And what had he simply believed? When I saw him later that night, I looked at him differently, not with the lingering pain of the past, not with the cold detachment I had carefully maintained, but with a new kind of curiosity, one that searched for answers instead of avoiding them. And for a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood something, if there were pieces of the story I had never been allowed to see. "Is something wrong?" he asked when he noticed my gaze, his tone quieter now, more attentive than it had ever been before. And I hesitated, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I was choosing how much to reveal, how much to test, how much to push. "Do you trust her?" I asked instead, the question simple on the surface but carrying more weight than I allowed it to show. And I watched his expression carefully, noting the way his brows drew together slightly, the way his gaze sharpened as if trying to understand where the question was coming from. "Why wouldn't I?" he replied after a moment, but there was hesitation there, subtle but real, and that alone told me more than any direct answer could have, because it meant doubt had already begun to take root, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge it. "Just a thought," I said lightly, turning away before he could press further. Because this wasn't about giving him answers. It was about planting questions, about creating cracks that would eventually force the truth to surface on its own. But the truth has a way of revealing itself whether you're ready or not. And later that same night, I saw something that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Something that shifted the narrative in a way I hadn't expected. Because when I passed by his study, I saw her again, standing too close, speaking too softly, her hand resting lightly against the edge of his desk, her posture open, inviting. And for a moment, it looked exactly like what I had seen in my past life. Exactly like the beginning of the betrayal that had destroyed everything. But then something changed. Something small but significant. Because instead of responding to her the way he once had, instead of leaning into the moment, his expression hardened slightly, his posture stiffening as if he were resisting something rather than welcoming it. "You should leave," he said, his voice low but firm, and the words caught me off guard more than anything else. Because they didn't fit the memory I carried. They didn't align with the version of him I had known. And for a brief moment, everything felt uncertain again, like the ground beneath me had shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. She paused, just for a second, and in that pause I saw it. The crack in her composure, the flicker of frustration that she quickly masked with a soft smile. But it was enough to confirm that something wasn't going according to her plan. Enough to show me that whatever control she had once held was beginning to slip. I stepped back before either of them could notice me, my mind racing as I tried to piece together what I had just seen. Because if he wasn't responding the same way, if he was resisting her now, then it meant one of two things. Either he had changed, or something I had done had already begun to alter the course of everything. And that realization brought with it a strange, unexpected feeling, not relief, not satisfaction, but something more complicated. Something that forced me to confront a possibility I hadn't considered before, that maybe the story I had lived wasn't as simple as I believed. And if that was true, then the choices I made now would carry consequences I couldn't fully predict. As I stood there in the quiet, the weight of that realization settling around me, I understood something with absolute clarity, something that would shape everything that followed. This wasn't just a second chance to fix the past, it was a chance to uncover the truth. And whatever that truth turned out to be, I would face it on my own terms this time, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the one who refused to be deceived again. By the time everything began to unravel, I already knew the ending wouldn't be the same, not because I had planned every step perfectly, but because the moment I chose myself, the story itself had changed. And now, standing at the edge of that chain, I could feel it clearly, the tension in every interaction, the unspoken questions hanging between us, the quiet awareness that something was coming to a breaking point, whether any of us were ready or not. It happened sooner than I expected, not in a dramatic explosion, not in a moment of chaos, but in something far more controlled, far more revealing, a confrontation that had been building slowly beneath the surface until it could no longer be avoided. She made the first move. Of course she did, because people like her always do when they feel control slipping. And this time, there was no softness in her approach. No carefully hidden intentions, only quiet precision as she positioned herself exactly where she needed to be. In front of him, in front of me, in a space where everything would finally be exposed. "I think it's time we stop pretending," she said, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the silence in a way that demanded attention. And I watched her closely, noting the way her composure held just a fraction too tightly, the way her eyes flickered between us as if calculating every possible outcome. And for the first time, I saw her not as a rival, not as a threat, but as someone who had underestimated the one variable she couldn't control: me. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting toward me, instead searching, uncertain in a way I had never seen before. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken me far too long to realize in my past life. That power doesn't come from being chosen, it comes from choosing yourself. And this time, I had already made that choice long before we reached this point. "Say what you need to say," he finally said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something unresolved. And she smiled slightly, not with warmth, but with something closer to satisfaction, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. "You know why I'm here," she said, her tone deliberate, her words carefully measured. "You always have." And for a brief second, silence fell between us, heavy and expectant, and I could feel the shift in the air, the moment where everything balanced on a single decision. In my past life, this would have been the point where I broke, where I reacted, where I let emotion take control and lost everything in the process. But this time, I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't interrupt, because I wasn't here to fight for something that was never truly mine to begin with. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing something he hadn't fully understood before, and then slowly, his expression hardened, not with anger, not with regret, But with clarity, I know, he said quietly, and then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, he added, and that's exactly why you should leave. And those words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because they weren't just a rejection of her, they were a decision, one that changed everything in a way I hadn't expected. She froze, just for a moment, her composure slipping in a way she couldn't fully hide this time, and I saw it clearly, the realization that whatever plan she had set in motion had already begun to fall apart, that the outcome she had anticipated was no longer within her reach. And for a second, something like frustration flickered across her face before it disappeared behind that familiar mask. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her voice no longer as steady as before. And he didn't respond, didn't react, just held her gaze with a calm finality that left no room for negotiation. And after a moment, she turned and walked away, her steps measured but just a fraction too quick, as if she needed to escape before the loss of control became undeniable. When the door closed behind her, the silence that followed felt different from any we had shared before, not empty, not distant, but full, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid, everything that still needed to be understood. And for a moment, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, because there was no script for what came next, no familiar pattern to fall back on. He turned to me slowly, his gaze searching, uncertain, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not the man I had loved, not the one I had lost, but someone standing in front of me with a choice he didn't fully understand how to make. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the control it once carried, and I held his gaze steadily, not with anger, not with pain, but with something far more certain. "Because I didn't need to," I replied calmly, and the truth of that answer settled between us in a way that couldn't be ignored. Because this was no longer about proving anything, no longer about fighting for a place in his life. It was about the fact that I had already stepped beyond it. "I can fix this," he said after a moment, the words coming out more like a realization than a promise. And I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of understanding, because this was the moment I had seen before, the moment where everything became clear to him just a little too late. "There's nothing to fix," I said softly, and for a second, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret, might have been fear, but I didn't let myself dwell on it, didn't let it pull me back into a story I had already left behind. "You don't understand," he continued, taking a step closer, as if closing the distance could somehow change the outcome, and I shook my head slightly, not in denial, but in quiet certainty. "No," I said, my voice steady, final this time. "I understand everything." And with that, I turned away, not waiting for him to respond, not giving him the chance to rewrite the moment into something else. Because this wasn't about him anymore. It never truly had been. It was about me, about the choice I had made long before we reached this point, the decision to stop living for someone who had never truly chosen me. As I walked toward the door, toward a future that no longer felt like something I had to endure, but something I could shape, I felt it clearly, the weight of the past lifting, the quiet certainty of a life that belonged entirely to me. And just before I stepped out, I paused for a fraction of a second, not to look back, but to acknowledge the truth I had finally accepted, the one thing that had taken me 2 lifetimes to understand this time. I didn't come back for love. I came back for myself,